Okay. Sorry. Jake Paul and Dana White. One of them makes his living beating up old people, and the other beats up... Maybe you can go check TMZ. You can figure that one out. But what did the two of them have in common besides beating people up? What if I were to tell you that the guy who sang "It's Everyday, Bro" was gonna save the UFC? Jake Paul began his social media career as a young boy growing up in Ohio with his older brother Logan, posting fun, childish videos on the budding YouTube video sharing website. But after blowing up on the 7-second video app Vine, rest in peace, the brothers would begin to reach new heights of social media fame. While Logan's story would take a whole other video to explain, so stay tuned for that, Jake has got quite a history of his own. He's the founder of the former content creation group known as Team 10, wrote and performed one of the most hated songs in history, and got fired by Mickey Mouse himself for terrorizing his neighbors in his extravagant suburban Los Angeles neighborhood. He even won an exhibition boxing match against fellow YouTuber Deji Olatunji, the younger brother of global internet superstar KSI. He did all of that in 3 years. But let's go back to his boxing career for a moment. After his bout against Comedy Shorts Gamer, the troubled Paul fell in love with the sweet science and found it as an outlet for his struggles as a human being. At the time of this recording, Jake Paul has a 7-1 professional boxing record with an eclectic group of opponents, ranging from fellow YouTuber Anisan Gibb, 3-time slam dunk contest champion Nate Robinson, retired MMA fighters Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, and Anderson Silva, and his most recent bout, a decision loss to Love Island star and 9-0 professional boxer Tommy Fury, which, by the way, is the only boxer he's actually fought. Yeah. Now you're probably still wondering how this is going to connect to the UFC. And for that answer, we go to Jake Paul's Twitter. Jake Paul has been quoted countless times criticizing the UFC and owner Dana White on fighter pay through Twitter, Instagram, and interview clips all across YouTube. It's even been reported that Jake Paul will be teaming up with Anderson Silva to help create a UFC fighters union in hopes it will help UFC fighter pay. Now, why Jake Paul is so passionate about UFC fighter pay when he's never been in the UFC, he's never had an MMA match, he's only beat up a bunch of old retired MMA fighters. It's beyond me. I don't know. Speaking of old MMA fighters, Jake Paul's scheduled to fight Nate Diaz on August 5th in his next professional boxing match. He's even offered to fight Nate Diaz in an MMA match with his new promotion. Jake Paul had always shown an interest for fighting in the MMA ring and was recently given an intriguing offer by an up-and-coming MMA promotion. PFL. The Professional Fighters League, or PFL, was launched in 2018 by financial fat cat Don Davis to present mixed martial arts in a way that it has never been done before. MMA as a whole is actually a fairly young sport, as it was not legal in the entire United States for many years. The UFC wasn't founded until 1993, and the sport was even illegal in the state of New York up until 2016. The UFC has pretty much run the MMA world since its inception, so other organizations have to find ways to distinguish themselves from the competition. The PFL has already implemented many new aspects, such as the first ever NFT launched by Professional Sports League, implementing an AI software to predict fight outcomes and even score rounds, and, my personal favorite, a playoff season format for championship belts. While the PFL has already done a pretty good job to shake up the sport, they've shown that they're far from done yet. On January 5th, Jake Paul signed a multi-year deal with the Professional Fighters League, in which he plans to make his mixed martial arts debut. The signing of Paul to the organization will undoubtedly garner a great deal of attention to the young league, but the contract goes a bit deeper than that. Forbes reported the following about the new deal. Paul and the PFL have co-created a pay-per-view division called PFL PPV Superfight, a division that guarantees fighters will receive 50% of revenue from its events. This 50-50 approach for the PFL PPV Superfight division is a very similar approach to what most boxing matches are, but it's very different from the UFC. Not long after the Jake Paul PFL deal was released to the public, former UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou signed a deal with the PFL as well, where the fighter was later quoted by ESPN saying, "In that contract, I'm not an independent contractor. In that contract, I have no rights. I have no power. I hand over all the power to you guys, and I've seen in the past how you can utilize that power." I came across an article by Sportscasting that did a really good job just explaining what the UFC model is, because it's very different from most professional sports. Like Francis Ngannou said, the fighters are more of independent contractors rather than like an employee of a larger business. While most major sports organizations sign contracts by years, the UFC tends to do it by fight. For example, bantamweight star Sean O'Malley just signed an 8-fight contract, which is one of the longer contracts in UFC history, even though that contract may only span over 3-4 years. Another unfortunate thing about these contracts is the UFC's ability to just fire and release the fighters whenever they choose. Many fighters with winning records even get cut because the UFC doesn't feel it's making them enough money, or they're just enough of a draw for them. Not only is this contract-to-contract approach very dangerous for young and up-and-coming fighters, the money that's coming in isn't even close. It's not even close to any other sports organization.
In a bad way.
In that same article by Sportscasting, a quote reads, Nate Diaz got a $20,000 base salary in his fight against Michael Johnson. However, after Diaz choked out McGregor and became a superstar, he renegotiated his salary. Afterwards, he got $250,000 to show up and fight Anthony Pettis. Now, the $20,000 base salary, that's per fight. That's not $20,000 a year, so it's not quite that bad. But still, $20,000 a fight. The most fights that a UFC fighter would have in a single year is probably 4 or 5. And so if you multiply that out to $20,000 a fight, that's only about $80,000 a year. While that's still a lot for like an everyday person, that'd be a lot for me. Compared to every other professional sport, that is chump change. That is absolutely nothing. According to ESPN, it was revealed that UFC fighters only make about 20% of what the company makes. But I've also seen statistics that have it even lower. Like I saw one that has the percentage as low as 13% of total UFC revenue goes to the fighters. Now, a lot of these numbers are actually pretty difficult to find, as the UFC, holds the cards pretty close to their chest. Now, let's take that 20%. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. We'll say 20% of total UFC revenue goes to the fighters. Let's take that number and let's compare it against some of the other big professional sports organizations. According to this article, the NFL and the MLB stand at about 48% of their total revenue going to the players, whereas the NBA is as high as 50% of its total revenue is going to the players. That's a 28% difference. 28. These other athletes in pro sports are making literally double what some of these baseline UFC fighters are making. Now, let's assume that there's a fighter that has that $20,000 base salary that Nate Diaz had. 4 fights a year, so we'll call that an $80,000 contract. Now, let's take that $80,000 a year contract and compare it to the minimum,
the lowest
contract that these other organizations offer. So for these other major sports organizations, it looks like the NFL is at about $750,000 a year. The NBA is looking right at $953,000, and the MLB is currently at $720,000. Now, we can also argue as much as we want about whether professional sports athletes should be making this kind of money at all. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. I mean, I love sports as much as the next guy, but it's kind of insane that a guy goes onto a field and is really good at hitting a ball with a stick and gets paid millions of dollars a year. You could say combat sports and other professional sports, they're very different. Like comparing a pitcher to Conor McGregor, they're very different athletes, it's a very different discipline. So you could say it's not really fair to compare those two sports. Because of this, we're going to take a look at the other biggest combat sport, boxing. To do this, I want to look at 2 of the biggest pay-per-view events in each of the sport's history. First, we will look at boxing's Floyd Mayweather versus Oscar De La Hoya in 2007, and the UFC's Conor McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov in 2018. Both events did right around 2.4 million pay-per-view buys. And while I'm not exactly sure what the exact pay-per-view price was for both of these, I feel like this is just a pretty good starting point, at least, since we don't have all the information, all the numbers. We can get a pretty decent idea, but maybe nothing set in stone from this. Love him or hate him, Floyd Money Mayweather has earned his nickname better than anyone else. Mayweather has headlined 5 of the top 10 biggest pay-per-view events in history, with wins over Saul Canelo Alvarez, Manny Pacquiao, and even the notorious Conor McGregor. Though Mayweather generated the most revenue from his fight with McGregor, we will examine his bout against Oscar De La Hoya due to the similar pay-per-view numbers. According to Sports Illustrated, the event event generated roughly $136 million in front of a sellout 16,200 people in the MGM Grand Garden in Las Vegas. Guaranteed purses were reported as $25 million to Oscar de la Hoya and $10 million to Floyd Mayweather. When factoring in the pay-per-view revenue, because the fighters get a portion of that in boxing, Oscar de la Hoya got around $52 million, and Floyd Mayweather was around the $25 million mark. To me, that is way too much money for any professional athlete to be making. But still, I mean, get your bag, I guess. And that's not even including endorsements. The UFC is incredibly limited on what endorsements individual fighters can get. Rather, they usually get endorsements to the UFC company itself. Like this new Under Armour deal. Nate Diaz said it himself in an interview that he wasn't seeing any money from this Under Armour deal. They were forcing the fighters to wear these Under Armour shoes sponsored by Dwayne Johnson, which I think they're kind of cool, honestly. It was just another regulation and another dollar in Dana White's pocket. So now that we've looked at the boxing numbers, let's take a look at the UFC. The largest pay-per-view event in MMA and UFC history was Khabib Nurmagomedov and Conor McGregor for the lightweight belt in 2018. The Dagestani Eagle put his perfect 26-0 record on the line to face MMA and possibly combat sports' biggest star at the time, Conor McGregor, after he had nearly a 2-year hiatus from the UFC. Build up to this fight was unlike anything we've ever seen, filled with merciless insults, heated exchanges, and even a 25-hour community service sentence for McGregor. When the event finally came around, it did record-breaking numbers as expected, filling the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas with 20,000 fans and earning an astounding 2.4 million pay-per-view buys. Despite actually having a higher live attendance and nearly identical pay-per-view sales, McGregor was guaranteed a $3 million purse, while Khabib was only guaranteed $2 million. A $30 million difference from De La Hoya versus Mayweather. Though McGregor predicted he earned about $50 million during the pre-fight buildup, that number has yet to be confirmed. Both fighters also received hefty fines and suspensions for their roles in a post-fight brawl after Khabib's victory over the Irish superstar. Well, my phone lost the rest of the footage. It's like 3 weeks later. I bought a camera. Let's try and salvage this, I guess. Though not all of the numbers have been released to the public, it's pretty obvious the differences between these events. It would be easy to assume that both the events would make a similar amount of money. I mean, just being that they had the same, or at least very similar pay-per-view buys. But that just doesn't seem to be the case. If this is the case that they made a very similar amount of money, how come the fighters are not seeing similar numbers? I know it's hard to make assumptions. I don't want to assume too much because I know I don't have every fact, I don't have every detail, but it's hard to deny that Dana White's being unfair to his fighters. So let's bring this all the way back to the beginning when we started with Jake Paul, which I don't even know how we got here at this point. But Jake Paul's PFL PPV Super Fight division is going to do a good job of bringing money to the fighters. Or at least it's supposed to. It's going to be a lot more similar to boxing, so I'm sure the fighters are hoping to get paid more like boxers, rather getting paid more like MMA fighters, which is like the whole point. We'll see how the actual organization and division does, how well they're going to be able to handle everything, but I mean, the UFC should be pretty nervous, honestly. These fighters finally have an opportunity to fight some of the big name guys and make big money. Something that the UFC doesn't like. It's just so difficult these days. If you're not Conor McGregor or Nate Diaz or one of the big name guys, it's so hard to make a career in the UFC. I mean, I just saw today that Alexander Pantoja, I don't know if I'm saying that right, who just fought and actually won the flyweight championship, was doing Uber Eats to make ends meet. That is ridiculous. He is a professional athlete, and he's doing Uber Eats. Professional athletes are supposed to be ordering Uber Eats. I really feel like the PFL can make a dent in the MMA community. It will hopefully force the UFC to start paying their fighters more, as more and more big-name fighters are going to go to the PFL for the big paychecks. And that's all thanks to the problem child himself. Let's give it up for Jake Paul, people. Come on. Thanks for watching this video, everybody. I hope you learned something.